I knew something was wrong the moment I walked into my bedroom that Tuesday evening and saw the small wooden box on my dresser sitting at the wrong angle, lid slightly ajar instead of closed the way I always kept it. My heart dropped, even though I already knew what I'd find, or rather wouldn't find, when I opened it. The watch was gone. The replica watch, to be precise, though Marcus didn't know that detail. I stood there staring at the empty velvet interior for a long moment, feeling a strange mix of vindication that my precautions 6 months ago had been justified, and rage that my instincts about my own brother had been right all along. Marcus had been staying with me for what was supposed to be a few weeks, just until I find a new place after his latest eviction. But those weeks had stretched into 4 months of him sprawled on my couch, eating my groceries, leaving his mess everywhere, and contributing exactly nothing to rent or utilities. I heard the front door open around 8 that evening and walked out to find Marcus standing in my kitchen with takeout from the Thai place down the street, just one container, because of course he hadn't thought to ask if I wanted anything. "Hey," he said casually, opening the drawer for a fork. "Where's Grandpa's watch?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't even look up. "Oh yeah, I borrowed that. Needed some quick cash. Took it to a pawn shop on Market Street. Got $800 for it. Not bad." He said it like he was telling me about the weather. Like he'd borrowed a cup of sugar instead of stealing the one thing my grandfather had left specifically to me when he died 2 years ago. "You borrowed it," I repeated, the words hollow in my mouth. "Marcus? That watch was the only thing Grandpa left me in his will." He shrugged, scooping noodles into his mouth. "I'll get it back soon. Relax. My business loan is about to come through and I'll have plenty of cash. It's just sitting in your room anyway. What's the big deal?" That casual dismissal of my pain, of the violation of going through my things, of taking something that meant everything to me, was so perfectly Marcus that I almost laughed. This was the pattern of our entire lives. Him taking what he wanted, me expected to accept it, our mother making excuses for why he deserved special treatment while I should be grateful for the scraps of attention I received. But he didn't know that the watch currently sitting in Lou's pawn shop was a $50 replica I'd ordered online 6 months ago, the same week Marcus moved his boxes into my guest room, and I realized I needed to protect what mattered most. The real watch, Grandpa's actual vintage Hamilton with the inscription on the back that read, "For my granddaughter who knows the value of things," was safe in a deposit box at First National Bank, where Marcus would never touch it. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had started so early, I barely remembered a time before it, when Marcus was just my brother, instead of the golden child who could do no wrong while I remained perpetually invisible in the corner of our mother's vision. When I was 16, Marcus got a brand new Honda Civic for his birthday, silver with a sunroof and a sound system he immediately upgraded with another $1,000 of Mom's money, while I got a card with a $20 bill inside and a note that said "Sweet 16" in her rushed handwriting. When I asked why the difference was so stark, Mom said Marcus needed a car to get to his after-school activities and his job at the mall. Conveniently forgetting that I'd been taking the bus to my 2 jobs since I was 15, saving every penny for the college fund that didn't exist because Mom had decided her resources were better spent on Marcus's future. He went to Chapman University, a private school with $30,000 annual tuition that Mom paid in full, while I worked overnight shifts at a diner and weekend mornings at a grocery store to cover my costs at the state school 40 minutes away, where I commuted because I couldn't afford campus housing. Marcus joined a fraternity, went to Cabo for spring break 3 years in a row, and graduated with a communications degree and no job prospects, while I finished my dental hygiene program with a 3.8 GPA and a job offer before I even walked across the stage. But at family gatherings, Mom would ask me when I was going to do something important like my brother, as if my steady career with benefits and a retirement plan couldn't compare to Marcus's vague claims of entrepreneurship that never materialized into actual income. Dad had died when I was 7, and Marcus was 11, a heart attack that took him before anyone understood what was happening. And something in Mom had broken after that, in a way that made her cling to Marcus as the man of the family, while treating me like an obligation she hadn't quite figured out how to love. Marcus had burned through 3 of Mom's financial investments in his imaginary business ventures. 15,000 for a photography business, where he bought expensive cameras and took exactly 0 paid jobs before selling the equipment on eBay for half what she'd spent. 22,000 for a consulting firm that never got registered as an LLC and existed only as a website template he abandoned after 2 months, and 8,000 for a food truck idea that ended when he realized he'd have to wake up early and actually cook. When Grandpa died 2 years ago, and his will specifically left me his vintage Hamilton watch with a note that read, "For my granddaughter who knows the value of things," Mom had been furious in a way I'd never seen before, saying the watch should have gone to Marcus as the man of the family, as if Grandpa's explicit wishes meant nothing compared to her desperate need to give Marcus everything, including the one thing someone had chosen to give to me. Marcus's presence in my condo had started as a temporary inconvenience and metastasized into a suffocating invasion that had taken over every corner of my life in ways I hadn't fully understood until I started cataloging them in my mind during the sleepless nights when his friends were laughing in my living room at 2 in the morning. He'd shown up 4 months ago with 3 suitcases and a story about being between apartments after his landlord had unfairly evicted him, though I later found out from his ex-roommate that he'd been 3 months behind on rent and had trashed the place. 2 weeks, he'd promised, just until he found something else, and I'd said yes because that's what I always did, what I'd been trained to do my entire life when Marcus needed something. But 2 weeks became a month, then 2 months, then 4. And he'd settled into my space like he owned it, leaving his clothes on my furniture, his dishes in my sink, his mess spreading through rooms I'd decorated and paid for and worked overtime shifts to afford. He contributed nothing, not a single dollar toward the $1,200 monthly rent, or the utilities that had nearly doubled since he moved in and started running the air conditioning at full blast all day, while he sat on my couch playing video games and calling it job hunting. I asked him to leave the first time after 6 weeks, standing in my own kitchen feeling like an intruder, as I suggested maybe he'd had enough time to find a place, and he'd looked at me with wounded eyes and said, "Family helps family, Cass. I thought you understood that," wielding our relationship like a weapon the way he always had. The second time I asked, he'd gone straight to Mom, and she'd called me within an hour saying, "Your brother is going through a hard time. Why are you being so selfish when you have this whole place to yourself?" As if my 2-bedroom condo was a mansion instead of a modest space I'd saved for 3 years to afford. 2 weeks before the watch disappeared, I'd come home from a 10-hour shift that had started at 6 in the morning to find Marcus had thrown out all my leftovers from the fridge, 4 containers of food I'd been planning to eat for lunches, because he needed room for the case of beer he'd bought with money he apparently had for alcohol but not for rent. When I confronted him, exhausted and hungry, and trying not to cry from sheer frustration, he'd shrugged and said, "It was old anyway. Relax. I'll buy you lunch sometime," which we both knew would never happen. I started locking my bedroom door after that, the only space in my own home where I could keep things safe. And when Marcus noticed, he'd complained to Mom that I didn't trust him, which led to another call where she'd used the word paranoid and suggested I was being dramatic about normal sibling dynamics, as if siblings normally had to hide their possessions from theft. The watch disappeared on a Tuesday, a fact I remember because Tuesdays meant I had to be at the clinic by 6 in the morning for our early patient block, which meant I was up at 5, moving through my routine in the quiet darkness of my own home that never felt entirely mine anymore. And when I passed my dresser to grab my watch for work, the small wooden box where I kept it was empty. My heart stopped even though I knew the real watch was safe in a deposit box at the bank, because the absence meant Marcus had been in my locked room, had gone through my things, had taken what he wanted without asking, and the violation of it hit me harder than I'd expected. I checked the whole room, thinking maybe I'd moved it, but I knew I hadn't. I called Marcus 3 times before I left for work. No answer. The clinic was busy enough that I couldn't dwell on it, but between patients, I kept checking my phone, waiting for him to call back, to offer some explanation that wouldn't be infuriating. He didn't call. I drove home that evening with my hands tight on the steering wheel, rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd confront him, but when I walked through my door at 6:30, he wasn't there. And I spent the next hour and a half pacing through my own condo, feeling like an intruder, checking his room, which was a disaster of clothes and takeout containers, finding nothing. He came home at 8 with a bag of Thai food that smelled amazing, just one container. Nothing for me, even though he knew I'd be home, and he walked past me toward the living room like it was any other evening. "Where's the watch?" I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. He turned around, surprised, like he'd forgotten I lived there. "Oh yeah, I borrowed that old watch, got $800 for it at a pawn shop. I'll pay you back when my business loan comes through." He said it so casually, like he was telling me about the weather, and I felt something crack inside my chest. "You went into my locked room," I said. "The lock is easy. There's a YouTube tutorial. Don't be dramatic, Cass. I'll get it back in a few weeks." The business loan was his fifth guaranteed venture this year, none of which had materialized into anything except disappointment and debt. "Which pawn shop?" I said. "What does it matter? I said I'll handle it." His voice had that edge it always got when I questioned him, that tone that said I was being unreasonable for having boundaries. "Tell me where it is, or I'm calling the police." I pulled out my phone. Marcus actually laughed, a short bark of disbelief. "For what? Borrowing something from my sister? Mom would disown you, you know that, right? Family doesn't call the cops on family." He turned back toward the living room, dismissing me, and I stood there holding my phone and shaking, not with fear, but with a rage I'd been swallowing for so many years, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. I didn't call the police that night because some part of me already knew that wasn't the play I wanted to make. That involving law enforcement would shift this into a different kind of confrontation that wouldn't give me what I actually needed, which wasn't legal justice, but something more personal, more pointed, more about making Marcus finally face a consequence that couldn't be explained away or smoothed over by Mom's checkbook and endless excuses. I stood in my kitchen after he'd dismissed me and walked away, my phone still in my hand. And I made myself take 5 deep breaths the way my therapist had taught me when I'd started seeing her 6 months ago, specifically because of the stress of having Marcus invade my space and my life. Then I texted him, keeping my message simple and controlled. "I need the name and address of the pawn shop by tomorrow morning, or I'm reporting the watch stolen." He responded within 2 minutes, clearly wanting to avoid that threat. "Lou's Pawn, 847 Market Street. Happy now?" I wasn't happy, but I was something else. Something that felt like clarity crystallizing in my chest as I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and opened a new document and started writing down everything that had happened since Marcus moved in, dates and details and dollar amounts, creating a timeline of his invasion that I'd been too tired and too conditioned to track before. 4 months of rent at $1,200 monthly, plus utilities that had gone from an average of 150 to nearly 300, plus groceries he'd eaten that I conservatively estimated at 200 per month. And suddenly I was looking at numbers that added up to over $7,000 he'd cost me, not counting the emotional toll of never feeling safe in my own home. I texted Rachel, my best friend since college who'd never liked Marcus, and had been openly horrified when I'd told her he was moving in even temporarily. He pawned the fake watch, got 800 for it, won't tell me which shop. Then immediately after, "Never mind, got the address. It's Lou's Pawn on Market." Her response came through in 3 rapid-fire texts. "Good. Then, let him hang himself. Then, do not bail him out. I'm serious, Cass. Let this play out." I stared at those words for a long time, sitting alone in my kitchen in the home I'd worked so hard to afford, and I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, that felt like something shifting permanently inside me after years of bending and accommodating and swallowing my own needs to keep peace in a family that had never kept peace for me. I wouldn't retrieve the watch, wouldn't march down there and reclaim the fake, and let Marcus off the hook with another close call he'd learned nothing from. I'd let the 30 days run out, let him fail to reclaim it on his own, let the pawn shop discover it was worthless, and let the truth detonate in his face in a way he couldn't blame on anyone but himself. I went to Lou's Pawn the next day during my lunch break. The address Marcus had texted me still pulled up on my phone as I drove across town to the industrial area near the old warehouses where Market Street turned gritty and practical, the kind of neighborhood where businesses dealt in cash and reality rather than pretense. The shop was smaller than I'd imagined, wedged between a check-cashing place and a bail bonds office, its window full of guitars and power tools and jewelry under dusty glass. And when I pushed through the door, a bell chimed, and a man looked up from behind the counter where he'd been examining something with a jeweler's loupe. He was maybe 60, heavy-set, with reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of face that had seen every hustle and sad story the city had to offer. "Help you?" he asked, and I told him my brother had pawned a watch here yesterday, that I wasn't here to reclaim it, but I had questions about the process. His expression shifted slightly, something careful coming into his eyes. "You're the sister," he said, and it wasn't a question. I nodded. Lou set down his loupe and leaned against the counter. "He said it was his," Lou told me, said it was a family heirloom his grandfather left him, vintage Hamilton worth several thousand, that he just needed some quick capital for a business venture, and he'd be back for it in 2 weeks. The lies came so easily to Marcus, so naturally, that hearing them repeated by this stranger in this pawn shop made something hurt in my chest that had nothing to do with the watch. "How does the redemption work?" I asked, and Lou explained the 30-day policy, that Marcus had pawned it yesterday, which meant he had until the same time 29 days from now, that the loan was $800, and with interest and fees he'd need $960 to reclaim it, that if he didn't show up by 5 p.m. on day 30, the watch became shop property, and Lou would evaluate it for resale. "Your brother seemed real confident," Lou said, watching my face. "Said his loan was coming through next week, that this was just temporary." I almost laughed, but it came out as something else, something tired. "There's no loan," I said. "There's never a loan." Lou nodded like he'd heard that story before too. I thanked him and turned to leave, but at the door I stopped and looked back. "When the 30 days are up," I said, "if he doesn't reclaim it, you'll inspect it then?" Lou confirmed he would, that he'd check the movement and the case and authenticate it before setting a resale price. I nodded and walked back out into the afternoon sunlight, and as I drove back to the clinic for my afternoon patients, I felt that clarity from last night solidifying into something harder, something like resolve, the plan taking shape with a precision that surprised me, because I'd spent so many years being uncertain and accommodating and afraid of confrontation, but this was different. This was about finally letting Marcus face a consequence that I wouldn't cushion or fix or absorb on his behalf, and the thought scared me less than it probably should have. Day 20 of 30 arrived on a Tuesday morning when I was eating yogurt, standing at my kitchen counter before my early shift, and Marcus wandered out of the guest room that had become his permanent residence in boxers and a stained t-shirt, scratching his stomach and heading straight for the coffee I'd made. I watched him pour a cup into my favorite mug, the one Rachel had given me with, "Nevertheless, she persisted," printed on the side, and I made myself ask the question casually, like I was just curious, like my heart wasn't counting down every single day until the deadline. "Have you gotten the watch back yet?" I asked, and he waved his hand dismissively, adding cream he hadn't bought to coffee he hadn't made. "I'm getting it next week," he said, that familiar overconfident tone he always used when he was lying. "The loan came through, I'm about to be flush." I nodded and rinsed my yogurt container and said nothing about the fact that I'd seen the rejection email 2 days ago when I'd opened my laptop, the one he borrowed constantly without asking, to find his Gmail still logged in with a message from Capital Bridge Business Loans with the subject line, application number 47839, denied. He'd applied for $15,000 for something he'd called Premier Sports Collectibles LLC, and they'd turned him down for insufficient credit history and lack of business plan. But here he was telling me the money was coming, spinning the same fantasy he'd been selling to himself and everyone else for the past 3 weeks. Over the next few days, I watched him post on social media about his upcoming venture, vague aspirational nonsense about big moves coming and building an empire with stock photos of success he'd pulled from the internet. And his girlfriend Shayna, who'd been essentially living in my condo for 2 weeks, now posted a photo of him sitting on my couch with her caption, "My entrepreneur boyfriend grinding," that made me feel physically ill when Rachel screenshot it and sent it to me with just the eye roll emoji and 3 question marks. The family group chat lit up when Mom shared one of Marcus's posts with, "So proud of my son," followed by 3 heart emojis. And I scrolled up to see that my own post from 2 weeks ago about completing my advanced certification in periodontal therapy had gotten exactly 3 likes. None from Mom, no comment, no acknowledgement of the fact that I'd worked for 8 months and paid $3,000 of my own money for credentials that would improve my patients' care and my career trajectory. Day 23 came, and Marcus asked me for money. Not even with any build-up or pretense, just walked into the living room where I was reading on my one day off and said, "Hey, I need to borrow $1,000 for initial inventory. I'll pay you back as soon as the revenue starts flowing." I looked up from my book and said no, and watched his expression shift through several stages of disbelief. "What do you mean no?" he asked, and I repeated the word, just no. And he launched into a speech about investment opportunities and how I didn't understand business, how I was being short-sighted and unsupportive, how family was supposed to help each other succeed, and I felt something that had been bending inside me for 4 months finally reach its breaking point. "You've been living here rent-free since March," I said, my voice level and cold in a way that surprised both of us. "You pay nothing, contribute nothing. You eat my food and use my utilities and have your girlfriend stay over without asking, and now you want $1,000 for inventory for a business that doesn't exist?" His face flushed red and he called me jealous, said I couldn't handle his ambition because I'd settled for being just a dental hygienist while he was building something real, that I didn't understand entrepreneurship or risk-taking or vision. "Get out of my house," I said, and he laughed, actually laughed, and told me he'd leave when he was ready, that if I tried to force him, he'd tell Mom I'd abandoned family, that she'd never forgive me for throwing her son out on the street, and I looked at this man, my older brother, standing in my living room in my home that I'd bought with money I'd earned, threatening me. And I said nothing else because I knew that in 7 days the truth would detonate, and all his confidence and all his lies would collapse in on themselves, and I wanted to watch it happen. Day 28 arrived on a Thursday morning, and I called Lou's pawn from my car during my lunch break, parked in the clinic lot with my half-eaten salad forgotten in my lap. And when he answered, I asked him to confirm the deadline one more time, even though I had it memorized down to the minute, and he told me Saturday at 5 p.m., day 30 exactly, that if Marcus didn't show up with $960 by then, the watch became shop property and he'd inspect it for resale value, and I thanked him and sat there after hanging up with my heart doing something complicated in my chest, because this was it. This was the moment I'd been counting toward for 28 days. The point where Marcus's lies and my careful planning would collide in a truth he couldn't spin or dismiss or charm his way out of. Friday night I came home from a long shift to find Marcus on my couch in his usual position, controller in hand, beer in my favorite glass, Shayna next to him scrolling through her phone. And I stood in the doorway of my own living room and made myself ask the question casually, like I was just reminding him of something minor. "Tomorrow's the deadline for the watch," I said, And he didn't look away from the TV screen where he was shooting at something, just waved his hand vaguely and said, "Yeah, yeah, I'll get it." But he didn't move, didn't set down the controller, didn't show any sign of someone who planned to come up with $960 in the next 18 hours. And I realized with a clarity that felt almost physical that he had no money and no plan, that he'd been lying about the business loan for 3 weeks straight, that he genuinely believed something would just work out the way things always seemed to work out for him because someone always fixed it. Usually mom, sometimes me, always someone. Saturday morning, I woke up early despite it being my day off, that nervous energy that comes before something important making sleep impossible after 6 a.m., and I made coffee and checked my phone and waited. And Marcus didn't emerge from the guest room until almost noon, stumbling out in boxers and the same shirt he'd worn for 3 days. And when I asked if he was going to get the watch, he said later, and made himself breakfast with my eggs and my bread and my butter, and I watched him eat standing at my counter like he owned the place, and I said nothing, because in 6 hours everything would change. I texted Rachel that I was going to yoga, and she sent back 3 skull emojis and "I want a full report." And at 2 p.m., I drove to Market Street and parked at the coffee shop across from Lou's Pawn, where I had a clear view of the entrance, and I sat at a window table with a latte I barely touched and my phone face up on the scarred wood. And I waited. 3 p.m. came and went with no sign of Marcus's car, the beat-up Civic that had been a hand-me-down from Mom when she upgraded. And I sent Rachel an update. Nothing yet, and she replied, "He's going to show up at 4:59, I'm calling it now." 4 p.m., and the light was starting to change, that late afternoon quality that meant the day was running out. And I thought about Marcus at my condo, maybe still in his sweatpants, maybe finally realizing what day it was, maybe starting to panic. And I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close to it, something like justice approaching on steady feet. 4:45, and I was starting to think he wouldn't come at all when his car pulled up fast and crooked at the curb in front of Lou's, and Marcus got out moving quickly, still in sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair uncombed, and even from across the street I could see the panic in the way he moved. And I waited exactly 2 minutes before I paid for my untouched coffee and crossed Market Street and pushed through the door of Lou's Pawn into the moment I'd been planning for 30 days. The bell above the door made a sound when I pushed inside, that generic chime that every pawnshop seems to have, and the interior was exactly what I expected. Glass cases full of jewelry and watches and electronics and musical instruments, the accumulated desperation of 100 financial emergencies lined up under fluorescent lights. And Marcus was at the counter with his back to me talking fast to Lou, his hands moving in that animated way he always gestured when he was trying to convince someone of something, and I could hear the strain in his voice even from across the shop when he said, "Can I pay half now, half next week? I've got $460, I just need a little more time for the rest." And Lou was shaking his head with the patient firmness of someone who'd heard every negotiation tactic ever invented, saying, "Policy is full payment by the deadline, or the item becomes shop property. I explained that when you pawned it." And that was when Marcus turned and saw me standing there just inside the door, and his expression went through this rapid series of changes, surprise and then something like relief and then calculation, and he said, "Cassie, perfect timing," with that false brightness he used when he wanted something, and I walked closer to the counter moving carefully like I was approaching something volatile and said, "Oh, Marcus, are you getting the watch?" with a tone I'd practiced that sounded genuinely surprised, and he turned back to Lou and then to me again and said, "I've got most of it. I just need to borrow $500. You can spot me that, right? It's your watch. Help me get it back." And I looked at him standing there in sweatpants that had a stain on the thigh and a t-shirt that was wrinkled like he'd slept in it, his hair uncombed and his face already red and sweating even though it wasn't hot in the shop. And I said calmly, clearly, "No." The word landed like a stone, and Marcus's face went from red to darker red, and he said, "What do you mean, no? It's your watch, you have to help me get it back." And I felt the attention of the other people in the shop shift to us, 2 other customers and Lou all watching now, And I said, "You stole it, you get it back." And Marcus started to sputter, cycling through his usual tactics, pleading first with, "Come on, don't be like this. I said I'd pay you back." Then threatening with, "Mom's going to hear about this. You know that, right?" And then guilt-tripping with, "I can't believe you'd let me lose Grandpa's watch over a few $100s. What kind of sister are you?" But I just stood there with my arms at my sides and my heart beating steady and strong and said nothing. And Lou looked at the clock on the wall behind him and said, "It's 5 p.m. Time's up. The watch is now mine." And he took the ticket Marcus had been clutching and turned toward the back room, and Marcus exploded, yelling, "You ruined this! You sabotaged me! You wanted this to happen!" And I said quietly, with a strength in my voice I'd never heard before, "I did nothing, Marcus. You did this." And Lou came back from the back room with the watch in one hand and a jeweler's loop in the other. And he sat down on the stool behind the counter and held the watch up to the light and brought the loop to his eye, and the shop went very quiet, and I waited for the truth to finally arrive. Lou held the watch under the light for what felt like a full minute, but was probably only 10 seconds, turning it over in his fingers with the jeweler's loop pressed to his eye, and I watched his expression change from professional assessment to something like confusion and then understanding. And when he lowered the loop and set the watch on the counter between us, his face had that careful, neutral look people get when they're about to deliver bad news. And he said, "This isn't what your brother claimed it was." And Marcus made a sound that was half laugh, half protest and said, "What? No, that's a vintage Hamilton. It's been in our family for decades. It's worth at least $5,000. I researched it before I brought it in." And Lou shook his head slowly and picked up the watch again, holding it so we could both see, and he said, "No, this is a cheap replica, a $50 knockoff if that, maybe less depending on where it was purchased." And he pointed to the back plate and said, "The weight's wrong, see how light it is? A real vintage Hamilton would have a mechanical movement and a solid gold or gold-filled case. This is plated brass with a quartz movement. You can see the seam where the plating's already starting to wear at the edge." And the silence in the shop was so complete, I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the traffic passing on Market Street outside. And Marcus just stood there, staring at the watch in Lou's hand like it had personally betrayed him, and then he stammered, "That's impossible. That was Grandpa's watch. It's been in the family for decades. There's no way." And he turned to me with his face cycling through expressions too fast to name and said, "This is the watch from your dresser, right? The one in the wooden box on top of your dresser?" And I looked at him and said calmly, clearly, with no emotion in my voice at all, "That's the watch you stole from my locked bedroom, yes." And Lou looked at me with those sharp eyes that had probably seen every kind of human drama play out across his counter. And he said, "Ma'am, did you know this was a fake?" And I met his gaze and said, "I did." And Marcus made a sound like he'd been punched and said, "You, what?" And Lou said, "So your brother pawned a fake watch?" Still looking at me, and I said, "He stole what he found. I didn't tell him to take it. I didn't give him permission to enter my room or touch my things." And Marcus's face went through confusion, and then realization, and then horror, and finally rage, all of it visible like watching storm systems move across a map. And he said, "You set me up. You switched it. You knew I'd—" But he stopped himself before he finished that sentence, before he admitted out loud what we all now knew, and I just stood there with my hands at my sides feeling calmer than I'd felt in months, maybe years, and I waited for him to understand what he'd done to himself. I said clearly, meeting Marcus's eyes without flinching, "I didn't switch anything, Marcus. 6 months ago when you moved in temporarily for what you promised would be 2 weeks, I put Grandpa's real watch in a safety deposit box at my bank, and I bought that replica and put it in the same spot in the same wooden box on my dresser because I knew I couldn't trust you." And Marcus's mouth opened and closed and he said, "You lying." But I cut him off, my voice sharper than I'd ever let it be with him before. "I protected what was mine because I knew you'd try something eventually, and I was right." And Lou was looking between us now, with the expression of someone piecing together a story he'd heard versions of 100 times. People stealing from family, people pawning things that weren't theirs. The same human failures playing out across his counter in endless variation. And he said slowly, "So let me get this straight. He stole a fake watch, and I loaned him $800 on a $50 piece of junk." And Marcus turned to him with his hands up, saying, "I didn't steal it, I borrowed it. There's a difference. She's my sister. It's not like I took it from a stranger." But Lou shook his head and said, "You pawned someone else's property without permission. That's theft in the eyes of the law. And you lied about the value to get a bigger loan, told me it was a vintage Hamilton worth thousands. That's fraud. I could call the police right now." And I watched Marcus's face go white and then red again as panic replaced anger. And he turned to me with his hands actually clasped together like he was praying and said, "Cassie, tell him it's fine. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. You're not going to press charges, right? We're family." And I looked at him standing there in his stained sweatpants, begging me to save him from consequences he'd brought on himself. And I said calmly, clearly, with no emotion in my voice at all, "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Marcus. You went into my locked room after looking up how to pick the lock on YouTube. You took what you thought was a valuable watch worth thousands of dollars, and you pawned it without asking me or telling me until I confronted you. The only misunderstanding was you assuming I'd leave something real where you could get it." And the other customers in the shop were openly staring now, not even pretending to browse. And Lou set the fake watch down on the counter between us, like evidence in a trial, and crossed his arms and waited to see what would happen next. Lou looked at Marcus with the expression of someone who'd dealt with 1,000 variations of this exact situation and said in a voice that was firm but not unkind, "You owe me $800 for the loan I gave you on false pretenses, and I need it now." And Marcus made a sound that was half laugh, half panic, and said, "I don't have it. That's why I couldn't reclaim it in the first place. I thought I'd have the business money by now, but the loan didn't come through." And Lou's expression hardened slightly, and he said, "Then we have a problem, because you obtained that money by lying about what you were pawning, told me it was worth thousands when it's worth about $50. That's fraud." And I watched Marcus's face cycle through emotions again, the panic winning now. And I said to Lou, keeping my voice calm and level, "What happens now, legally?" And Lou looked at me and said, "Legally, I can report the fraud to the police. He misrepresented the item to obtain a loan. That's a criminal offense. I've got the paperwork, his signature, his ID on file." And Marcus turned to me with his hands up in that pleading gesture again and said, "Cassie, please, don't let him do this. Tell him it was a mistake. Tell him you're not pressing charges." And I looked at him standing there begging me to save him from the consequences of his own actions, the way Mom had saved him from consequences his entire life. And I said clearly, "I'm not doing anything, Marcus. You did this to yourself." And I pulled my phone out of my purse and said, "But I am calling Mom. She should hear about this." And Marcus's eyes went wide and he said, "No, wait, don't call Mom. We can figure this out ourselves." But I was already dialing, and I put the phone on speaker and held it between us, and Mom answered on the second ring with, "Cassie? What's wrong?" in that voice she used when I called outside our usual Sunday evening time, and I said calmly and clearly, "I'm at Lou's pawn shop on Market Street with Marcus. He's here to reclaim Grandpa's watch that he stole from my room 3 weeks ago, except he can't pay the redemption fee, and it turns out the watch is a fake replica that I planted because I knew he'd steal from me eventually." And there was silence on the line for a long moment, and then Mom said, "What are you talking about, Cassie?" in a voice that suggested I was making things up or being dramatic. And Marcus lunged for the phone, but I stepped back out of his reach, and Lou said loud enough for the phone to pick up, "Ma'am, I'm Lou Castellano, owner of this shop. Your son pawned what he claimed was a vintage Hamilton watch worth thousands of dollars. I gave him an $800 loan, and it turns out the watch is a cheap replica worth about $50, and now he can't pay back the loan." And I heard Mom make a sound like she'd been struck, and Marcus was saying, "Mom, she set me up. She switched the watch." and the other customers in the shop weren't even pretending to look at the merchandise anymore. They were just openly staring at us, and I saw one woman in the corner with her phone up filming, and I thought about asking her to stop, but then I thought, no, let her film. Let there be a record of this. And Mom said through the phone speaker, I'm coming down there right now, nobody do anything until I get there. And the line went dead. Mom arrived in 15 minutes, though she lived 20 minutes away, and I heard her car before I saw it, the engine revving as she pulled into the small parking lot in front of the pawn shop. And she burst through the door with her purse clutched against her chest, and her face flushed red the way it got when she was about to make a scene. And she looked around wildly until her eyes landed on me and Marcus standing at the counter with Lou behind it, and the fake watch still sitting there under the fluorescent lights, like evidence at a crime scene. And she said loudly enough that everyone in the shop turned to look. What is happening here? What is this about a watch and police? And I said calmly, keeping my voice level and clear, Marcus stole from me, pawned what he thought was a valuable watch, and now he can't reclaim it because it turns out it's fake and he's broke. And Mom turned to Marcus with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and anger and confusion, and she said, Is this true? Did you take Cassie's watch? And Marcus immediately launched into his defense, saying, She tricked me. She set me up. She switched the real watch for a fake one and let me pawn it knowing I'd look like an idiot. And Mom turned to me with her eyes narrowing and said, Cassie, did you deliberately give your brother a fake watch? And I met her eyes without flinching and said, I protected my property because Marcus has been living rent-free in my home for 4 months, eating my food, using my utilities, disrespecting my space and my boundaries, and I knew he'd eventually steal something because that's what he does. The real watch is safe in a safety deposit box where it's been for 6 months. This was insurance. And Mom's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, and she said in that voice she used when she was trying to sound reasonable but was actually furious, You manipulated your own brother. You set him up to fail. And I felt something snap inside me. Some final thread of patience or hope or whatever had kept me trying to win her approval for 28 years. And I said clearly and firmly, I protected myself from a thief. And it was the first time I'd ever called Marcus that out loud, the first time I'd used that word in front of Mom, and the silence that followed was thick and heavy, and Lou cleared his throat and said, Ma'am, I don't mean to interrupt family business, but your son owes me $800 for the loan I gave him on false pretenses, and if he can't pay it, I'm pressing charges for fraud. And Mom's expression shifted again, her practical side emerging the way it always did when money was involved. And she said, You're going to press charges over a fake watch? And Lou said patiently, I'm going to press charges for fraud, ma'am. He told me the watch was a vintage Hamilton worth thousands of dollars. I gave him $800 based on that claim. That's obtaining money under false pretenses. That's a crime. And Mom turned to Marcus and said in a different voice now, quieter and sharper, You don't have the money to pay him back? And Marcus looked at the floor and said quietly, The business loan didn't come through. Mom's face went through a series of rapid transformations as she processed what Marcus had just admitted, and she said in a voice that was quieter now but edged with something sharp, What business loan, Marcus? What are you talking about? And Marcus looked at the floor, and then at me, and then at the fake watch still sitting on the counter, and he stuttered, The sports memorabilia business. I told you about it. The loan was supposed to come through last week, but there was a delay with the processing. And I felt that same snap inside me again. That same breaking of whatever had kept me quiet for so many years. And I said clearly and loudly enough that everyone in the shop could hear, There is no business, Mom. There never was a business. He's been unemployed for 7 months, squatting in my condo, lying about job interviews and business loans and opportunities, playing video games 16 hours a day while I pay for everything. And Mom turned to Marcus with an expression I'd never seen before, something between horror and disappointment and disbelief. And she said, Marcus, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you've been looking for work. And Marcus opened his mouth, but nothing came out, and I continued, because now that I'd started, I couldn't stop. He throws out my food to make room for his beer. He has friends over at 2 in the morning when I have to be at work at 6. He won't pay a single bill or even buy groceries. And when I ask him to leave, he guilt trips me about family and calls you so you can tell me I'm being selfish. And Mom's face had gone pale now, and she said, "Cassie, that's not fair. You're making this sound worse than it is." And I said with a laugh that sounded harsh even to my own ears, "I'm making it sound exactly like it is, Mom. You've enabled him our entire lives, and now you're watching it play out in real time." And Marcus said, "Shut up, just shut up." But his voice was weak and desperate, and I turned to him and said, "No, I'm done shutting up. Remember the $15,000 Mom gave you for your photography business 3 years ago? The cameras are on eBay for half what you paid. You spent the rest on a trip to Mexico with your friends. And the $22,000 for your consulting firm? There is no consulting firm, it was never registered. No LLC, no business plan. You cashed the check and it disappeared over 6 months." And Marcus lunged toward me, but Lou stepped forward from behind the counter and said firmly, "That's enough. Back up." And Marcus stopped, but he was shaking with rage or shame or both. And he said, "You have no idea what you're talking about." And I said, "I have bank statements and screenshots and text messages." "Marcus, I've been documenting everything since you moved in because I knew eventually it would come to this." And I turned to Lou and pulled my wallet out of my purse and said, "I'll pay the $800 he owes you." And Lou looked surprised and said, "Ma'am, you don't have to do that. This is his debt." And I said, "I know I don't have to, but I want this over. I want him to have no more excuses and no more ways to drag me into his disasters." And I pulled out my credit card and handed it to Lou. Lou processed the payment and handed me back my credit card. And Marcus immediately said, "See, I knew you'd come through, you always do," with something like relief in his voice, as if I'd just proven that everything was fine between us, and always would be. But I turned to him and said in a voice that was steady and clear and final, "This isn't for you. This is so Lou doesn't press charges and you don't drag me into your legal drama when the police get involved." And I looked at Lou and said, "We're square now, right? There's nothing else he owes you?" And Lou nodded, looking relieved that this situation was resolving without him having to involve the authorities, and said, "Yes, ma'am, we're square. Thank you for taking care of this." And I turned back to Marcus and said with my hands steady at my sides and my voice not shaking,